We will be in Mark chapter 3, verses 31 through 34. I'll give everyone a minute to get there. Wonderful. Okay. Mark 3, 31 through 34. Then Jesus' mother and brothers arrived. Standing outside, they sent someone in to call him. A crowd was sitting around him, and they told him, "Your mother and your brothers are outside looking for you." "Who are my mother and brothers?" he asked. Then he looked at those seated in the circle around him and said, "Here are my mother and brothers. Whoever does God's will is my brother and sister and mother." This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. So imagine that you fell into a deep sleep on June 28th, 2007, the day before the first Apple iPhone was released. And when you awoke, it was 10 years later. And as you make your way out the door and down the street of the neighborhood, things seem, for the most part, familiar. Sure, there's some nicer cars in the driveway, but by and large, things look the same. But as you continue your walk, you see the neighbors that you used to say hi to, the kids your kids used to play with, and the families you'd spend weekends with. And instead of the normal, natural, communal gatherings that would take place in the evenings, everyone's stuck inside. Or if they are outside, they're stuck to a screen you can't seem to understand. So you head into work the next day, and it's more of the same. Coworkers you used to chop it up with are buried in their cubicles. The lunch spot you used to frequent across the street has hollowed out, with only a few guests eating silently, alone, staring at a screen. You get in your car to go home, and on the road, the same thing. People looking, instead of at the road, at screens. Eventually, you would go out of your mind, right? Wondering what in the world happened, wondering why everyone stopped talking and started staring. This is the thought experiment that Tobias Rose Stockwell portrayed in his book, Outrage Machine. And Stockwell uses this illustration as a reference for how much our world has actually changed in just the last 2 decades. Jonathan Haidt, in his unbelievable book, The Anxious Generation, How the Great Rewiring of Childhood is Causing an Epidemic of Mental Illness, he describes in detail the effects of the technological era that we have come of age in. Seriously, parents, I know you probably don't have time to read this, but I would encourage you, make time. I think this should be required reading for all parents. It is that good. But also, it is 300 pages. And so if you don't have time, no stress, and no shame, here's the Cliff Notes version. Haidt theorizes that the mental health epidemic that we are seeing amongst our young people right now is due to what he calls the decline of the play-based childhood and the subsequent rise of the phone-based childhood. So first, the decline of the play-based childhood. That scenario posed by Stockwell is many of our kids' realities. The life that they have been born into is a radically different world than what most of us grew up in. And the pace of change has caused stressed out parents to seize control over their stressed out kids, limiting what Haidt believes is one of the single most important factors in a child's healthy development: play. He writes, quote, "Play is the work of childhood, and all young mammals have the same job. Wire up your brain by playing vigorously and often. Young mammals want to play, need to play, and come out socially, cognitively, and emotionally impaired when they are deprived of play. In play, young mammals learn the skills they will need to be successful as adults. And they learn in the way that neurons like best, from repeated activity with feedback from success and failure in a low-stakes environment." See, the problem is, in our modern moment, for many, is that this low-stakes environment that Haidt talks about has all but disappeared. A fixation with getting ahead and planning for success has overtaken many children's play and substituted it with pressurized performance. There's this almost obsession with becoming secure financially, educationally, socially, materially, vocationally, and emotionally as early as possible. And yet, in seeking to fast-track children's success, stressed-out parents are actually undercutting it. Haidt continues, quote, "We decided that the real world was so full of dangers that children should not be allowed to explore it without adult supervision, even though the risks to children from crime, violence, drunk drivers, and most other sources have dropped steeply since the 1990s. This misallocation of protective efforts to shield children from the dangers of this world is malforming us into people who are emotionally, socially, and spiritually fragile." Haidt, by the way, is a self-described Jewish atheist, and yet even he is concerned with the lack of communal spiritual formation that is taking place in our society. And these drastic societal changes have had a profound impact on our parenting. Daniel DeVries wrote an article in September of last year for the USA Today, and it began like this, quote, "The Surgeon General has a new public health warning, and this time the hazard isn't tobacco or alcohol, it's parenting." DeVries goes on to share the highlights of the Surgeon General Vivek Murthy's public health advisory entitled "Parents Under Pressure." And here's what he found. Of note, 33% of parents rated their stress level on a scale of 1 to 10 as an 8 or higher. 40% of parents say that on most days they are so stressed they cannot function. And roughly half of parents term that stress, quote, "completely overwhelming." And 60% said stress makes it hard to focus. These are just a few of the profoundly concerning findings that Murthy uncovered as he surveyed thousands of parents across the U.S. And his hypothesis is that parents are facing more stress today than perhaps at any other time in recent history. See, Stockwell, Haidt, DeVries, Murthy, they're all pointing to a similar end. Anxious people are becoming anxious parents, raising anxious kids. And the cycle of anxiety and stress is causing us to close our grip tighter when we should be releasing it. Think about it. What was once a cultural norm has become taboo. Rather than inviting other adults into a child's life, we have offered an alternative message popularized by the phrase stranger danger, which was virtually non-existent in the English language until the early 1980s and then took off in the 1990s, shaping a world where we tell others today, "Stay away from my kid. Don't talk to them. Don't discipline them if they're misbehaving. Don't get involved." And Haidt's conclusion is this, quote, "When adults step away and stop helping each other to raise children, parents find themselves on their own. Parenting becomes harder, more fear-ridden, and far more time-consuming, especially for women." As one Christian author and mother writes, quote, "We must stop and think this through. On the one hand, we of course must protect our children from harm. On the other hand, we must not presume that sheltering them will accomplish this. Perhaps our children need to know that when they confront doubts and fears, sexual temptations, and moral and faith crises, we will not be shocked, offended, or hurt by this reality." And so, in place of a play-based childhood is a screen-based childhood, where we think that we have far more control as our kids are cloistered in rooms and homes with a screen. And yet, statistically speaking, online is where far more dangerous people and activity is thriving. However, 40% of parents give their children unlimited access to screens. And so within this unlimited access, foundational harms, as Haidt calls them, are embedding themselves within. Social deprivation, sleep deprivation, attention fragmentation, and addiction. In other words, as we replace socialization with screens, we find ourselves technologically addicted, unable to focus, and struggling to sleep. Does this sound familiar, my friends? Sound a little bit like your life, or maybe your child's life? See, as these rarely talked about cultural shifts continue to root themselves in our society, the consequences are being felt. Stressed out children are becoming stressed out parents who are parenting even more stressed out children. And the cycle seems to be never ending. And most of us are checking out, numbing out, or pretending like it all doesn't exist just to survive the next day. Now, listen, I know many of us know this, right? Like intuitively, we understand that something isn't right. And so please know that my goal certainly is not to make anyone, especially you parents, feel helpless, like you're doing a bad job or not measuring up. My point is, many of us feel helpless and extremely overwhelmed. We recognize that the water's tainted, but no one, it seems, wants to test it and find out why. We recognize that something's wrong, but we don't know what to do. And so the question then is, how do we stop this? How do we reverse the social decline that is crippling our ability to flourish? The Surgeon General has solutions. In his reports, he offers suggestions like boosting child tax credits, increasing paid family and medical leave, and investing in communal institutions like libraries. All of that is great, but it will not satisfy. Instead, I contend that the church, living as a family, is the preferred model of community that Jesus, the Scriptures, and church history offer to us for human flourishing. I contend that the church, living as a family, is the preferred model of community that Jesus, the Scriptures, and church history offer to us for our flourishing. And my goal over the next couple of minutes is to cast a compelling vision for why the need of the hour is not economic stimulus, paid parental leave, or investment in public places, though I am all for that, and all of that could be tremendously helpful. But my thesis is that what our world is most longing for is neighborhood-based community, for presence in proximity, for a family with which to do life together. Life Together, that's the title of this teaching series that we've been in over the last few months, unpacking and exploring the centrality of the table within the Christian faith. And we've arrived to the penultimate week, and today we're wanting to re-envision and reimagine a way forward, a future that is ancient. How in a world riddled with anxiety, fear, distrust, and doubt, it is the church where we are wedded to the one we are most longing for, Jesus Christ. It is the church practicing the way of Jesus, together as a family, for the sake of the world, where a foretaste of heaven on earth can be experienced. When we open up the Scriptures, we find a vastly different cultural context than what we find ourselves living in now. And this will help inform us as we attempt to extrapolate the truth behind Jesus' words regarding family. However, I must warn you, Jesus' words were as provocative and challenging then as they're going to sound now. And so know that my goal today is to humbly and honestly bring forth what Jesus says about family, and how when we determine where our allegiance lies, it opens up a vast range of possibility for healthy families to be developed. Is that fair? Cool? Great. If you have a Bible, please turn with me to the Gospel according to Mark. It's the second book in what the Bible calls the New Testament. I'm going to be reading from chapter 3, beginning in verse 31. Mark writes this: "Then Jesus' mother and brothers arrived. Standing outside, they sent someone in to call him. A crowd was sitting around him, and they told him, 'Your mother and brothers are outside looking for you.' 'Who are my mother and my brothers?' he asked. Then he looked at those seated in a circle around him and said, 'Here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does God's will is my brother and my sister and my mother.'" Interesting, right? Like, what does Jesus even mean by this? Well, let's gather some cultural context. In the first century, Jewish society was marked by what we call a strong group culture. And a strong group culture is anchored by habits, norms, traditions, or values, which in turn shape the individuals who make up the broader group. In other words, the individual isn't primarily known for the distinct skill set, gifts, or abilities that they possess. Rather, they are known primarily for the group that they belong to. And so if you want to remember what a strong group culture is, we can break it down to this: we over me. We over me. In the New Testament world, the group took priority over the individual. And we see this all throughout the Scriptures, right? You have James and John, who are referred to as what? The sons of Zebedee. Joseph, Jesus' father, is referred to as a son of David, meaning he belonged to the family line of David. You have Peter, whose first name is Simon and is often referred to as Simon, son of Jonah. But it's not just families, it's affiliations. There's Rahab the prostitute, Simon the zealot, John the baptizer. There's also the power of place. Who was Jesus? He was Jesus of Nazareth. Do you see the strong group culture at place? Group identity informs individual identity. A weak group culture, on the other hand, places the individual at the center. Norms, traditions, and values have very little impact on individual behavior. Why? Because they are not shared. In a weak group culture, the individual knows best. And so a weak group culture can be summarized as this: me over we. This is not rhetorical. Which culture do you think we are living in today, my friends? A weak group culture, right? Yes. We are living in this post-Christian, hyper-individualistic society where to be successful is to be autonomous. When we don't need anyone else, then we've truly made it. How's that working for us? I mean, is the autonomous life the good life? Is it the best life? But we live in a culture where the value of family is being torn apart, where rootedness is being replaced with transience. And in our pursuit of more money, more comfort, more space, more freedom, more flexibility, more you fill in the blank, we are pulling up the roots of relationships that over time allow us to experience the rich benefits of authentic familial community. In one study, the APA found that, quote, frequent relocations in childhood are related to poorer well-being in adulthood. The participants of that study were found to have, quote, fewer quality social relationships as adults. See, our transience, our hypermobility, and our obsession with autonomy is disrupting our ability to cultivate family. And so again, I ask you, is this the best way to live? Jesus' picture of a family is vastly different than you probably think it is. I mean, if you're like me, I grew up in American evangelicalism where it was preached to me that the blessed family was a suburban soccer mom, a breadwinning dad and coach with a 2-story house, 2 cars, 2 pets, and 2.5 kids exactly, right? Like, this was my ideal. This was the picture painted for me of what a successful family looked like. Perhaps for you, the concept of what a family is stirs up pain more than anything else. Maybe you were abandoned by your family at a young age. Maybe you've had to navigate the relational complexity of multiple step-parents and step-siblings. Perhaps you were adopted by loving parents, but the ache of not knowing your real parents has left this untenable wound within you. Maybe you've bounced around from home to home and never felt settled in a safe place. Perhaps you walk in here the product of a divorce, or you recently got divorced, and the picture in your mind of what you thought a family should look like has been shipwrecked. Can I encourage you today, my friends? Whether you're sitting here in church today holding hands with the family God has blessed you with, or you're here alone again, spiraling, trying to figure out if you will ever belong to a family. Wherever you are at on that continuum, Jesus has good news for you. Look here, Luke 14, starting in verse 25. Large crowds were traveling with Jesus, and turning to them, he said, if anyone comes to me and does not hate their father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple. And whoever does not carry their cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. That doesn't feel like good news, does it? I'm sorry, let's try another passage. Here's Matthew 10, beginning in verse 34. Jesus says, do not suppose that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to turn a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A man's enemies will be the members of his own household. Anyone who loves their father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Anyone who loves their son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Whoever does not take up their cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Whoever finds their life will lose it, and whoever loses their life for my sake will find it. Okay, is anyone else confused? Right? Like, Micah, isn't this supposed to be good news? What is this? Seriously, what is this? I've honestly asked myself that very same question. But after studying and wrestling with these words, I realized, my friends, this is the gospel. This is the gospel, and the 3 clearest, most explicit passages regarding family that come from Jesus' mouth, a similar message is spoken. When push comes to shove, Jesus reigns supreme. When backed into a corner, our allegiance is to Jesus alone. When forced to choose, Jesus is the answer. Now, that may not be a popular answer with respect to a teaching on family, but neither was Jesus's. I mean, we live in this hyper-individualistic society where family has lost so much meaning, and yet, if you're being really honest, how many of you are offended by these words? I am. Right? If I don't hate my mother or brother, if I don't hate my wife, if I love them more than I love Jesus, I'm unworthy? But if it's this shocking and painful for us to take in, imagine how enraging it would have been for a strong group culture whose entire identity was wrapped up in the tribe. Imagine how hard it would have been for them to hear these words. See, in antiquity, blood ran deeper than even romantic love. So what is Jesus getting at here? Like, does Jesus hate families? Of course not. In a moment, we'll unpack some of the familiar language used all throughout the New Testament. But before we uncover what it looks like to be countercultural families, we must first grasp this fundamental truth that allegiance to Jesus is primary. That the calling on our lives, when we surrender our lives to Jesus, if you call yourself a Christian, is to willingly surrender whatever identity you've placed in your blood family in exchange for entrance into the multi-ethnic, multi-generational, multilingual family that is the kingdom of God. Here's the truth, my friends. Jesus is not against family. He just wants your primary family to be his family. And this is good news. See, once you've pledged your allegiance to Jesus, you are then adopted into a group, a community, a church, a family, where over time you grow, mature, and are formed more and more into the image of Jesus. As you spend time in this family, you begin to grow into the father or mother you've always wanted to become. You see generational sin halted. You see relational feuds dissipate. You see forgiveness and restoration enter the picture. You see people of different places, backgrounds, skin colors, and socioeconomic statuses gathering around your table. You see family, as it was intended, begin to be developed. You see what Jesus prayed for in the Lord's Prayer: your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven, come to fruition. This is, as best as I can understand it, the biblical ethic of family. Okay, we doing okay? Everyone still with me? All right, beautiful. So, Jesus' vision for the church is that of a family. He calls the church the bride of Christ. He claims himself as the groom. Jesus literally says that whoever does the will of God is his brother and sister and mother. All throughout the New Testament, the apostles greet one another as brothers and sisters in Christ. We call God what? God the Father, yes. So just to reiterate, Jesus' teachings here are not anti-your family in the sense that to be a follower of Jesus isn't to leave your parents and siblings or your spouse and kids in an act of surrender. That would be unfaithful, not faithful. What Jesus is teaching against here is partial allegiance. He's teaching against lukewarmness, as he calls it. When we've committed our lives to him, we begin to understand the beautiful vision he has for family, which is so much bigger than who you share a bed or a bank account with. The church, as a family, is the preferred model of community that Jesus, the scriptures, and church history offer to us for human flourishing. And here's why this vision is so beautiful. It holds space for everyone listening. This vision is big enough to encapsulate family both inside and outside the household. This vision holds space for singles, single parents, divorcees, widows, foster parents, grandparents, cousins, uncles, and third cousins twice removed. The invitation for all of us, regardless of our at-home family structure, is to practice the way of Jesus, together as a family, for the sake of the world. To be and become an interconnected web of devoted individuals who mutually love, serve, and care for one another. In the Greek, family is this word oikos, and in its most basic form, it simply means household. Meaning wherever you find yourself planted right now, if you're a single college girl living with a few roommates, if you're an uncle caretaking for your sister's kids, if you're a grandparent who's fostering, or anything in between, if you call the sanctuary your church, then this is your household. This is your family. And so my invitation to those of you who have been attending irregularly or who feel uncommitted here, here's my invitation to you. Be it at the sanctuary or another church, pick a place. Commit. Get involved. And if it is healthy, not perfect, but healthy, stay. Stay. Because you're missing out on experiencing the beauty and goodness of Jesus' vision for belonging. A family is waiting for you. But you must choose to participate in it. You must take the seat reserved for you at the table. And to the parents in the room who are stressed out and anxious, parenting alone, my invitation to you is to open up your eyes and to look around. You don't have to do this alone. Bring others in. Ask for help. Share your needs. This is what the church is for. The weight of the world does not need to rest on your shoulders. You can share the load. You can admit that you don't have everything figured out, and your kids can and will learn things from others, other kids, other moms, other dads, other cousins, uncles, coworkers, and congregants that they cannot learn from you. And could some of that stuff be less than helpful? Sure. Will some stuff need to be unlearned? Probably. But by and large, who we surround ourselves with shapes and forms who we become. And I hate to break it to you, but you are not perfect. And if the only model your kids have is you, they will inherit more of your dysfunctions, fears, frustrations, and strongholds than if they are exposed to others who are healthier in the areas that you are not. So release the grip. Get outside of yourself and your home and embrace the household, the family that surrounds you. Honestly, the New Testament picture of the church as a family flies in the face of our individualistic cultural orientation. I mean, the cultural expectation is to keep our options open, right? Options signify power and control. So whatever church personally meets my needs as defined by myself for whatever length of time, that is my church for the time being. But as soon as that church begins challenging my sense of self, the inherent selfishness within me, the sins I'm willfully or unwillfully committing, sins I'm publicly or secretly engaged in, the moment the church asks me for anything outside of what I deem desirable, I move on. And what results is this pattern of jumping from church to church in an effort to have my needs met as I continue on the journey of self-discovery, self-actualization, and self-fulfillment. My friends, we have allowed our preferences to determine our placement. And we think that by leaving, we'll find what we're looking for without realizing that you cannot reap healthy fruit without taking the time to plant deep roots. The medieval German theologian Thomas à Kempis put it this way. He said, quote, "Wherever you go, there you are." Meaning whatever relational baggage you're carrying with you now, if you leave, you'll just carry it with you wherever you go next. Did you know that the expression personal savior shows up exactly 0 times in the pages of Scripture? Here's the quote we love from Robert Mulholland, quote, "Spiritual formation is a process of being formed in the image of Christ for the sake of others." My friends, we have an agenda for you here. We do not pretend otherwise or try to hide it. The end goal, just so we're clear, is Christ-likeness, becoming like Jesus. The end goal, the telos, is love. And if love is the aim, then how can that aim be achieved by abandoning relationships which require self-sacrifice, service, and sanctification? See, the reason why church as a family is so beautiful is because it forces us to live out what Jesus preached. Here's Jesus in John 15. "Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends." And when we live into this, we become a model for a world around us, demonstrating what love in action tangibly looks like. Tyler Staton, in his recently released book, The Familiar Stranger, writes about an American journalist, Sebastian Junger, who covered the war in Afghanistan for over a decade. And while doing so, he noticed a really strange phenomenon. Many soldiers were voluntarily returning to the war for second, third, and fourth deployments. They'd come home safe and then voluntarily re-enlist. And Junger started to ask, why is that? Like, for so many, war seems to feel better than peace, and a hard life in the barracks among comrades is preferable to a cozy life in the suburbs among friends and family. Why is that? And his conclusion was that a robust sense of community and an embodied counterculture does more to draw out the human heart than comfort, wealth, ease, or social progress ever could. But here's the problem, Staton writes. Quote, we live in such a transient culture. And our transient culture resists formation in community. The common discipleship structure of the American church today is built almost entirely around individualized spiritual practices that aid and even glorify transience. Why practice Sabbath on Sundays in a community when you can do it anytime, anywhere, alone, goes the common thinking. And listen, individual spiritual practices are necessary to our spiritual formation. So I'm not outright discounting them. If you've been around here for any length of time, you know we value practicing the way of Jesus. But I am saying that community and life together is an essential and irreplaceable aspect of practicing the way of Jesus. To practice the way of Jesus alone for the sake of yourself is quite frankly just not the gospel. It's self-glorification. And it misses the mark of the invitation that Jesus actually extends to us. So, practically speaking, what does this look like? What are the marks of a church living as a family? Are there rhythms and practices that we can engage in to cultivate this? There are. And while this is not an exhaustive list, here's a few that I think will help get us started, whether you're single for life, single and ready to mingle, married, divorced, widowed, or anything in between. Everyone here can participate in these practices. And they are practices that we are to do together. So first, a church living as a family celebrates one another. A church living as family celebrates one another. I love how the Apostle Paul puts it in 1 Thessalonians 5. He says, therefore, encourage one another and build each other up, just as in fact you are doing. See, the church in Thessalonica was a celebrating church. They built each other up. And Paul says, yes, keep it up, keep it going. A healthy family celebrates one another. They cheer one another on and push one another to become all that God has created them to be. Life is at its best when we have family standing with us in the mountaintop moments of life, cheering us on and encouraging us to press forward. But a church living as a family also bears one another's burdens. Paul again in Galatians 6 says, carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. See, it's not just the mountaintop moments of life that we need family around us, but it's especially in the valley moments. The weight and pain of this life and world can feel unbearable at times. Life can be cruel and unfair and depressing. Have you ever found yourself in a season where it just feels like one thing after another is going wrong? And before you know it, you're spiraling out of control. And Paul's telling us, hey, let her help you. Let him in. Bring them close. Allow this community, this oikos, this ecclesia, this church to help you carry your burdens. Dr. Todd Hall, in his book, Relational Spirituality, writes, quote, when we become disillusioned, our temptation is to focus on what we are getting or not getting from our community. This is understandable. We all feel this way at times, and we all need support and love from others in our community when we get stuck in such an emotional place. But we may need to reach out and let others know how we are feeling. Making ourselves vulnerable requires great courage, but it is the fuel that drives authentic connection and transformation in community. See, some of us have become so ingrained in the cultural pursuit of autonomy that we have lost the ability to let others in. And so instead of receiving the help and the assistance we need, we settle for silently suffering alone. And in doing so, we miss out on experiencing the beauty of the church as a family and what it could be. So, my friends, celebrate one another, yes, but also open yourself up and allow others to carry life's burdens alongside you. This is how we live out the way of Jesus in a hurting world. We celebrate the highs, and we stick close amidst the lows. Number 3, a church living as a family confesses sin to one another. I spent the bulk of my teaching a few weeks ago on confession, so I won't go into too much detail here, but when we confess our sins, we find healing and wholeness for our souls. To be fully known and fully loved by another human being is the closest expression we have to agape or unconditional love between one another. The pastor and author John Ortberg said it this way, quote, "We generally sin alone, but we heal together." Or as they say in AA, I get drunk, we stay sober. My friends, the church at its best, as a family, creates space for sin to be confessed, for forgiveness to be extended, and for healing to begin. This does not negate the presence of consequences, but it does remove the presence of shame and condemnation. Fourth, a church living as a family does life with one another. We do life together. We welcome one another. We eat together and we spend time together. We practice hospitality by transforming a house into a home, welcoming guests, making them feel safe and at ease. Jesus said that when you welcome strangers, people who cannot repay you, you are blessed. Paul's pretty blunt in Romans 12 when he writes, share with the Lord's people who are in need. Practice hospitality. The essence of a family is a group of people gathering together around a table and sharing. Sharing a meal, sharing time, sharing stories, sharing possessions, and sharing love. There's something so beautiful, so simple, and so rich to this practice. Gathering around the table and breaking bread is at the heart of the spiritual journey. Why? Because we simply are not meant to follow Jesus alone. It is in relationship that we are formed into the image of the triune relational God. Number 5, a church living as a family learns, worships, and prays with one another. Listen to Luke's words in Acts chapter 2 regarding the early church. Jake taught on this just last week, verse 42. And they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, in the fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers. See, to establish a rhythm of teaching, community, and practice is so healthy for families. If you're watching online, we are so glad that you're with us. But if you're watching online and you are not plugged into a physical, local community, please get into one. The ability to gather together as households who make up the broader family of Christ is a deeply formational practice. Protect the Sunday gathering as much as you can, not because this is the pinnacle or the end-all be-all, but because it is an anchor. The Sunday gathering tethers us together as brothers and sisters who are seeking to practice, participate, and permeate the world together. Here on Sundays, we are equipped through teaching, loved through community, and challenged through practice to be the people of God in our day-to-day lives. Consistency and commitment to the gathering matters. And finally, number 6, a church living as a family is generous to one another. Look here at Acts 4, beginning in verse 32. All the believers were one in heart and mind. No one claimed that any of their possessions was their own, but they shared everything they had. With great power, the apostles continued to testify to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus. And God's grace was so powerfully at work in them, all that there were no needy persons among them. From time to time, those who owned land or houses sold them, brought the money from the sales, and put it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to anyone who had need. Dr. Joseph H. Hellerman writes, quote, the sharing of material resources is a central part of Jesus' new surrogate family. The ethos of a Christian community, of a church, of an oikos, of a family is generosity. Generosity permeates every corner of our lives because it is generosity which so loudly preaches to a world bent on selfish hoarding and greedy accrual. We, as followers of Jesus, learn the art of contentment. And in our excess, we give. We share. We share our stuff with one another. We share our hearts with one another. We share our food with one another. We share our very lives with one another. The author of Hebrews puts it beautifully, writing, "And do not forget to do good and to share with others, for with such sacrifices God is pleased." For parents, it can look like modeling generosity for your children, allowing them to see what sacrificial giving to a bigger cause than yourself looks like. For married couples, it can look like outdoing one another in generous acts of love towards one another. For singles, it can look like allowing the flexibility of your relational schedule to routinely step outside of yourself when it would be easy to cater everything around you. Wherever you are and whoever you are, the invitation for all of us is to give. Give your time, give your money, give your gifting as a sacrifice to Jesus and in obedience to the way that he instructs us to follow in. Generosity is the fuel to the fire that advances God's mission and vision through his chosen vehicle, which is the local church. And when we do this well, when we do this right, it does not extravagantly enrich pastors at the top. It does not invest solely in bigger, better, faster equipment or buildings. And it does not fearfully hide behind deception and manipulation. When this is done right, it allows us to testify to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus as a countercultural community of love is established, a community that thrives and flourishes as a wellspring in a dry land. And so while this is not exhaustive, this is the dream. An interconnected web of devoted individuals who mutually love, serve, and care for one another. A haven for broken people who practice the way of Jesus, who participate in community, and who permeate the world. A church living on mission together as family. Here's the beautiful thing about family. For better or for worse, we all belong to one. And I recognize that for some of us here, family has been the biggest source of pain, disappointment, or disillusionment of your life up to this point. But I believe that Jesus, being who he says he is, he has the power to redeem your situation. Whether that's mending and healing old wounds or giving you the strength to form a new path, to begin a new legacy, or to write a new story. Each of us have the responsibility of cultivating healthy communal rhythms in our church on Sundays, around tables and homes on weekdays, and in our neighborhoods and in our city always. But my friends, I have to be honest, this is not easy. Hellerman writes, quote, "One of the dangers in all of this talk about community is the temptation to idealize the concept of the church as a family and to fail to embrace the reality that doing family right is tough stuff at church and at home. It was difficult for Paul and it is difficult for us. We will likely experience as many failures as victories along the way." So please do not leave here under the assumption that this vision casted today will come easy. Although the church as a family is the preferred model of community that we're offered, it's also really messy. You will get hurt. You will be disappointed. You will be let down. You will be failed. And you know what? You will hurt. You will disappoint. You will let down. You will fail. Such is the human condition. Putting imperfect people in proximity to other imperfect people creates, surprise, an imperfect church. Our hope, our security, and our identity does not rest in one another. It rests in Jesus, who is perfect. And as we learn to endure faithfully, forgive repeatedly, and love unconditionally, we discover the greatest gift that we are afforded, the very presence of God, made known and made real by other followers of Jesus who possess the very same Spirit that raised Christ from the dead within them. And so what's keeping you from living into this? Is it fear? Is it control? Is it past hurt? Is it your devices? What if the life you desperately want requires you to face, not avoid, the beautiful mess in front of you that is relationship? My friends, I believe that our greatest witness in the Western individualistic, technology-centric world that we live in today is the same that it was for our forefathers and mothers in the early church 2,000 years ago. It is our committed, consistent love of God and neighbor. That as we demonstrate the qualities of a disciple of Jesus, showing mutual affection, love, tenderness, and care towards one another, as we build lives of stability rooted in a rich, thick web of interdependence, we will begin to cultivate families, households, communities, churches that function as the light of the world that Jesus calls us to be.